What do you do when the man who was obsessed with you, the man you thought you had gotten away from, who you believe kept following you, shows up in front of you? I want to know because I don't. And what do you do when he tells you that he was trying to protect you because he wasn't the only person who had their eyes on you? You ever hear the saying, you shouldn't point out things about people's appearances if it can't be fixed in 10 seconds? Because, well, my classmates clearly never did. I looked more feminine than most guys, and because of that, I was constantly picked on, assumed to be gay or bi, and left alone since they just couldn't figure me out. And who could blame them? Neither could I. I was still figuring myself out. That's why, when given the opportunity, I joined this program to learn more about LGBT rights, and maybe a bit about myself. And it was on one fateful day of the program that I met him, Edgar. He was mid-40s. He'd been in the military, but despite his appearance, had a soft personality. He was a guest speaker, and when he finished, I went up, got acquainted, and we hit it off. My parents were always arguing and drinking, and so I saw him as a good role model. Someone I could finally look up to, an uncle, a godfather, and coach. We started emailing him where I told him I volunteered at the local theater. Oh, the local theater. I've been thinking of volunteering there myself. Before long, we began working in the theater and hanging out together, until one day, a classmate pulled me aside. You shouldn't be around that guy anymore, she told me. I've seen the way he looks at you. It's creepy. I told her she was overreacting. After all, what would she know? She had never looked at me twice, and now that I finally have a friend, she tells me to give it up because she saw something? Well, she hadn't earned my trust. He had. So I gave him the benefit of the doubt. But the seeds had been planted, and I couldn't help but notice the way he'd look at me up and down, or how he'd try to hold my hand or put his arm around my waist. Then one night at the theater, while we were backstage, he came up behind me and began caressing my neck, saying, "Your collar is off." Then, one by one, his hands began to travel down, past my shoulders, my back, and eventually my hips. Instinctively, I tried to inch away, but his hand closed. He was now gripping me. He gave me a squeeze before letting go as the audience applauded. 100 eyes on the stage, and none could see what had just happened to me. I packed up my stuff, said I wasn't feeling well, and left, then and there. That night, when I got home, my computer was blowing up with emails from Edgar. He told me that I was beautiful, and he couldn't get me out of his head that people thought we looked cute together, that he'd like me to be his, that he'd like to do things, intimate things to me, things that would make my knees weak. It was long and descriptive, and I felt nauseous at the thought that this man, my friend, had been harboring these thoughts, these fantasies, all this time. So I deleted the emails, marked his address as spam, quit the theater, and avoided all the places we used to hang out. But his emails, they just kept coming. After a while, I got a new job as a cashier. Not exactly the best job if I was trying to avoid someone, but the emails had stopped and it had been a second. That's what I thought, at least. Until he showed up and made a beeline toward me. I felt my heart pick up its pace. I felt my mind was racing. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. I was just stuck there. A cold sweat running down the back of my neck like his hands once did. By the time he made his way up the line, I could barely breathe. I braced myself, but he didn't say anything to me. Just smiled and left. Ever the optimist, I wanted to believe he moved on, forgotten. But after that day, he kept coming back. So I kept a close watch at the cameras, the door, the parking lot, every aisle. I grew paranoid. I felt someone watching constantly, even in the storage room in the back, even before opening and after closing. And while it started at work, the feeling followed me home. I had nightmares about this man. If he knew where I worked, he probably knew where I lived. I was ready to quit again when one day, during a late shift, as I was about to clock out, Edgar walked through the door, past the close sign, toward me and said, "You are being followed." "By you?" I said under my breath. "No, by this group of people, 2 men, 1 woman. I think they're part of this underground church. They've been following you for some time now." I felt every hair on my body stand up, felt myself gasp for air. I wasn't just paranoid, I was actually being watched. He reached out to my shaking hands, and I held on. Despite everything, he was all I had. He told me they might be here, outside, now, waiting for me to leave, alone. So, he offered to escort me to my car. After a moment, I said okay. There were only a few cars in the parking lot that night. Mine was the furthest away, and between me and my car, there was only one other vehicle. A quick look saw that it was empty, so we made a beeline toward my car. As we approached this other car, I remember Edgar saying he should probably check, just in case, and told me to keep walking. Just as I was about to reach my car, I grabbed for my keys when I heard a car door open behind me. I turned around, and it was Edgar, cloth and rope in hand. There was no one else. It was his car. It was always him. Then he pulled me into his car. My hands grabbed at the edges of the doorframe. I could feel my heart racing as my mind told me to fight for my life. I could feel one of his arms still tightly around my waist as the other one wandered lower. I was terrified and couldn't think at all. I used all of the strength I had to pull myself out of his grasp and onto the pavement of the parking lot. My knees hurt when I hit the ground, but there was no time. I jumped to my feet and sprinted towards my car. On the car door, I could see my reflection with Edgar behind me growing bigger, closer. I grabbed my keys, my hands still shaking, and fumbled to unlock my car as his footsteps approached rapidly. Just before they reached me, I opened the car door and slipped inside, but not before I felt his grip on my arm. He tried to pull me out, cover my mouth with a cloth when I grabbed the car door and slammed it against his arm. He let go. I shut the door, locked it, and stepped on the gas. In my rearview mirror, I could see him, standing there, still watching as I turned the corner and drove to my parents. I didn't tell them what had happened. Not my parents, my workplace, or the police. Edgar had a military background, and he probably had connections. I felt too afraid to come forward, so I didn't. Instead, I ditched my old phone number, old license plate, and applied for a transfer to another store downtown. I remember my new coworkers asking me why I transferred when I told them I just didn't feel comfortable. That's when one of them, Chris, decided to chime in. "That's 'cause you're a snowflake. You don't know what the real world is like." I felt my face burn up with anger before I blurted out how a man had tried to kidnap me in the parking lot, how I take self-defense classes now, carry mace with me at all times, and how I still can't sleep at night. A silence fell over the room like a blanket before Chris, almost in self-defense, decided to criticize me for not bringing it up to the police. He said I must have deserved it, that I must have secretly liked it or wanted it. I was at a loss for words. How could he say that? Then a customer came in. Almost everyone went back to work, leaving me there on the verge of tears. I couldn't see it coming, but from behind I felt hands wrap around me. It was one of my new coworkers, Holly, giving me a hug as I burst into tears. She held my hands in hers and told me that I should never feel like I deserved anything that happened. That no one else, could fully understand what I went through or was going through. She would later become my girlfriend. I never saw Edgar again. Before, I didn't understand why someone would keep something like that to themselves. Why would they let someone get away with it? But I understand now that there can be many reasons people don't speak up. Don't ever let anyone victim shame or blame you. They do not know your story.